Welcome back to The Explainer. I am absolutely thrilled you're here today. We're going to be focusing on something that actually affects every single one of us every single day. We're talking about the deep sociological structures of governance. Essentially, we're taking a look at the architecture of control, and specifically, those fascinating dynamics between power and authority. So, right off the bat, why do we obey? I mean, it's a pretty profound thought, isn't it? It hooks right into human nature. When you stop at a red light or pay your taxes or, follow a law that you might personally completely disagree with, why do you do it? Is it because you're forced? Or is it because you're voluntarily complying with a system you believe in? Well, that absolutely crucial difference is exactly what we're going to break down today. Here is our quick roadmap for today. 1. Defining true authority. 2. The pillars of political authority. 3. Max Weber's 3 types. 4. Power versus authority. And finally, 5. The distribution of control. All right, jumping right into Section 1, defining true authority and looking beyond brute force. Now, the historical road of this word is kind of fascinating. Authority actually derives from the old Roman notion of auctor or auctoritas. See, in Roman custom, the Senate was made up of men of reason and elders with experience. And their job wasn't to just dominate people, it was actually to give counsel, to advise, and to basically augment the decisions of the popular assembly with tradition and moral values. So originally, having authority meant you were guided by reason and wisdom, not just dominating people through fear. The political theorist Carl Friedrich actually distilled this whole idea into a brilliant little phrase. He said authority is the capacity of reasoned elaboration. Just think of it like a parent and a child. The authority of a parent really rests on their ability to give a reasoned elaboration as to why the child should or shouldn't do something. The very moment a parent loses that capacity to explain and just resorts to physical or psychological force, well, that's no longer authority, right? That's just coercion. True authority actually regulates behavior by speech and words, not by force. Moving right along to Section 2, the pillars of political authority and how systems maintain control. Okay, so to convert raw power into stable political authority, a system relies on a few key characteristics. It definitely involves power relationships, but crucially, it requires a minimum use of force. Relying on sheer force all the time is just way too expensive and completely unstable. Instead, authority leans heavily on sanctions, positive rewards and negative punishments. It also takes organized efforts, like propaganda, to circulate favorable ideas. And all of that ultimately builds the strongest pillar of all, ideology. There's this fantastic quote that brilliantly illustrates the power of that final pillar. Robert E. Dowse and John A. Hughes point out that ideology appeals to people so emotionally that they transcend their immediate self-interest. And according to the source text, whether we're looking at communist states uprooting capitalism, capitalist states blocking communist thought, or Middle Eastern nations using Islamic ideology to mold life around religious texts, the underlying mechanism is literally exactly the same. Ideology provides this powerful emotional glue, a normative system that makes the public accept a leader's control as proper and completely justified. Okay, Section 3. We're going to dive into Max Weber's 3 types, or the faces of leadership. The absolute crucial point Max Weber makes here is that authority relies entirely on validity. Basically, a power only becomes an authority when the people actually believe the leader has the right to rule over them. And Weber pointed out that this belief, this validity, basically stems from 3 different sources. Type number 1 is rational legal authority. Now, this is generally considered the best form for modern societies. In this system, you aren't actually obeying a person, you're obeying the legally established rules and the office itself. So, for example, the authority of a prime minister or a president. It doesn't come from their own personal power, it comes from the Constitution. That official can only use their authority within the strict boundaries of that law. The second type is traditional authority, which is obviously much, much older. Here, obedience isn't based on some set of impersonal laws, but rather on personal loyalty to traditional norms and customs. Think of kings ruling in ancient times, or political posts in tribal governments that have been sanctioned by generations of tradition. Your obligation to obey is essentially an accustomed obligation to the past. And the third type is charismatic authority. This is where obedience is inspired purely by the extraordinary personal qualities or even the heroism of the leader. The leader themselves is the direct source of the authority. The source text gives a really fascinating historical comparison from India to illustrate this. Leaders like Jawaharlal Nehru and Indira Gandhi commanded massive, disciplined followings because of their intense personal charisma, which went way beyond the strict legal bounds of their offices. Now, contrast that with figures like Fakhruddin Ali Ahmed, who acted more as a constitutional rubber stamp. Their legal rights were exactly the same, but that charismatic authority made all the difference in their actual day-to-day political influence. Which brings us to Section 4, Power versus Authority, the ultimate showdown. So let's compare them directly. Authority is built on reasoned elaboration, voluntary assent, and the recognized right to receive obedience. Power, on the other hand, relies entirely on force, threats, coercion, or enticement. It regulates social behavior without giving any convincing reasons. Now, realistically, a government needs both, right? It needs authority to get the silent majority to willingly follow the laws, and power to tackle extreme fringe rebellions. But a government that relies only on power, completely without authority, well, that's incredibly unstable. This quote from Bertrand de Juvenel just totally hits the nail on the head, and it's probably the single most important takeaway of this entire explainer. He says, authority ends where voluntary assent ends. Think about that. The exact second people stop voluntarily agreeing to follow you, you no longer have authority. You might still have a military, you might still have a ton of wealth, but you are left holding nothing but naked power. Finally, let's wrap up with Section 5, the distribution of control, or who really pulls the strings. We hear a lot of talk about equality, but I want you to consider this for a second. Is political power ever evenly distributed? Like, does a perfectly equal distribution of power exist in literally any actual political system? Well, the sociological reality, as detailed in our source material, is a pretty resounding no. In pretty much every society, political power remains concentrated in the hands of elite minorities. These elites take non-political advantages, things like massive financial resources, better access to education, control over business, and access to mass media, and they translate them directly into political dominance. They're the ones making the major decisions. The masses, on the other hand, rarely dictate those decisions directly. Their influence is largely restricted to just voting in periodic elections. So the idea that political power is vested perfectly evenly in the hands of the many, it's just simply not a reality. And because of this inherent imbalance, authority is actually super fragile. The text outlines that the decline of authority in a state usually happens in two specific ways. The first is strictly physical. It's when a government simply doesn't have the military strength to put down an armed and determined minority. But the second way is intellectual and moral. Authority disappears when the government itself loses that capacity for reasoned elaboration. When leaders start resorting to hastiness, emotionalism, or blatant favoritism instead of sound reasoning, the majority of people quickly realize the system has forfeited its right to receive obedience. So, I want to leave you with this final, provocative thought today. Look around at the systems operating in your own world right now, from your workplace to your local government, all the way up to the global stage. Do the leaders in your life rely on reasoned elaboration to guide you, or are they mostly just relying on raw power? Keep that question in the back of your mind as you navigate the architecture of control all around you. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and as always, keep questioning the world around you. See you next time.